Covin.
And good morning, Mr. Covin. How are you?
Good morning.
Where are you employed?
I'm currently employed at the Georgia Bureau of Investigations, Division of Forensic Sciences, commonly known as the State Crime Lab.
And what do you do for the Georgia Bureau of Investigations?
I am a microanalyst or scientist in the trace evidence section.
And if you can tell us about
here
your
you go.
education and training.
Here's your
I
gunshot
received
residue.
a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Albany State University. And upon being hired at the GBI Crime Lab, depending on which area of analysis they will be employing you in, you will begin a training program. So for me, when I was promoted to a scientist position, I started off in the Gunshot Primer Residue program. And the training lasts about 6 to 8 months, was consistent of practical exercises, written and oral exams, a competency test at the end, which is like a mock case that I had to get the correct answer to, a mock trial phase, and then about a 3-month-long supervised casework phase where I was doing real casework, but my trainer was also going through some of the technical processes with me.
And have you had any training outside of your training with the Georgia Bureau of Investigations?
As it pertains to gunshot primer residue, no, I have not.
While at the GBI, how many cases have you dealt with concerning gunshot residue?
Concerning gunshot residue, over 1,000 at this point.
And have you ever been qualified to testify in the state of Georgia as an expert in gunshot residue?
Yes, I have.
About how many times?
About 82 or so times.
You're right, this time the state would like to tender Mr. Covin as an expert in gunshot residue and trace evidence exam.
Now, yesterday we talked about contrast. What's the contrast here when we have an expert on this? Well, he actually examined something in this trial. We have this witness on the stand who's been qualified as an expert over 80 times. What's the contrast here with this witness? Do you think that would stand out to the jury? We have other witnesses that have been qualified once before or 0 times before in this trial. When you hear 80 times, doesn't that seem a lot more credible in contrast to what we've seen before? Is this actually an expert? Will we take what he says seriously?
Examination.
All right, he's so qualified and may testify as an expert in those matters.
If you could tell the jurors as a microanalyst, what are some of your job duties and responsibilities?
So as a microanalyst in the trace evidence section, I perform casework in the areas of gunshot primer residue, or GSR, paints and coatings, plastics and polymers, or tape, fractured materials, and some questioned materials or general materials cases.
And if you could tell the jurors, what is gunshot residue and how is it formed?
Gunshot primer residue, or GSR, is a collection of microscopic particles that are formed when a firearm is discharged. These particles contain all 3 of the elements, lead, barium, and antimony, and are molten in morphology, showing that they've been exposed to a lot of heat and pressure during the discharging of that firearm.
And when the gunshot residue or the gunshot powder comes out of the firearm, what direction does it generally go in? What happens with?
The GSR particles form a vapor cloud when the firearm is discharged. So I liken it to maybe baby powder in the way it behaves, kind of a cloud or a plume around that firearm in all directions. And then also some of that GSR, the GSR particles traveling with the bullet as well.
How do you test for GSR on items or materials?
Typically, GSR is tested and collected using what we call a GSR collection kit. And these kits contain vials with what we call stubs. They're adhesive samplers, 1/2-inch in diameter metal discs with black carbon adhesive tape on the top. And whatever surface you want to examine for GSR, whether it be a person's hands or clothing or so on and so forth, you can take those samplers and dab the surface randomly to pick up any particulate matter that is there. And then once those samplers are submitted to us, we will input them into an instrument that's called a scanning electron microscope that is equipped with an energy dispersive X-ray spectrometer, or SEM-EDS for short. And all that is just a very high-powered microscope that uses a beam of electrons instead of light, like you would usually see in a microscope that you would see in a biology classroom. This instrument will then allow us to see what's on the surface of those samplers, any particulate matter that is there, we can see it, and then get an elemental profile of what those particles are made of. So again, with GSR, we're looking for molten particles containing all three of the elements together: lead, barium, and antimony.
Are there certain surfaces that are better to test for GSR than others?
Yes, there are. As far as like,
Your hand.
so typically, the best evidence as far as GSR is concerned is a person's hands. You can also sample surfaces such as clothing items or anything that's made of cloth or textile material. Any other surfaces can be sampled for GSR, but some surfaces don't do as well as retaining those GSR particles, and as well as making it difficult to actually sample. But any surface can technically be sampled for GSR.
And if a surface is clean, so if it's your hands, if the hands are washed, or if it's a vehicle and the vehicle is cleaned, would that prevent you from getting GSR results in cases such as that? Can it affect getting results?
Can you get closer to the mic?
Yes.
Thanks.
When it comes to a person's hands, if GSR particles are in fact there, washing the hands will cause you to remove most, if not all, of those GSR particles. The same can be generally said with other surfaces, especially harder surfaces. If you wipe those down or rinse those down, any GSR particles that are potentially there mostly will be lost. When it comes to clothing items or surfaces that are more cloth or textile material, most of those GSR particles, if they are in fact there, will also be lost. But we have seen that, for example, with clothing items, very small amounts of GSR can still persist even after washing your clothes.
And in a vehicle, are there certain places that as a scientist with the GBI that you ask law enforcement to get samples of for you to test? Are there other parts of a car that are better to test for GSR than others?
We would prefer that the headliner of a vehicle is either submitted or sampled for GSR. Again, all surfaces can be sampled for GSR inside of a vehicle, but some surfaces, the harder surfaces, just don't do as well as retaining those particles. So things such as a gear shifter or the steering wheel may not be good surfaces to sample for GSR, even though it's possible. But the headliner, maybe the headrests of the seats would be your best areas to sample for GSR.
I want to direct your attention to DOFS case number 2022-1007212, where you asked to perform any testing in that case.
Yes, I was.
And who was the agency that submitted the request?
Your Honor, may I look at my notes?
You may, if they'll help refresh your recollection.
Yes. Will they help refresh your recollection?
Yes, they will.
All right.
And I'm sorry, it was which officer?
Which agency?
Agency, the Atlanta Police Department.
And what was the agency reference number?
The agency reference number was 2207-31882.
And who requested the testing to be done?
An investigator, A.E. Hogan.
And was there a named victim on that case?
Yes, there was.
And who was that?
Mr. Shymel Drinks.
And what was submitted to the GBI for testing?
So as far as GSR analysis is concerned, a headliner that is identified as being collected from an Audi A5 was submitted.
Okay. And in front of you, it states Exhibit 388 BB. And there's some fresh gloves. Tell me if you recognize Exhibit 388 BB.
Hopkins always double squeaks.
Okay, so this is item number 1, which is containing the headliner from the Audi A5. And I recognize it by the GBI specific barcode here with the GBI case number and item number of this particular package. I also recognize this package by the seals, where I initialed the seals here when I completed the analysis, and my initials and date when I started the analysis.
And can you walk the jury through what you did with that particular piece of evidence in order to test for GSR?
Okay, so once I am assigned this particular case, I will then go and retrieve this item of evidence out of the trace evidence evidence storage location, and then begin my analysis for GSR. So for this particular case, I was tasked with actually sampling the headliner before beginning my examination. And so I took this item of evidence into a clean processing room and began sampling this headliner using those stubs or adhesive samplers that I mentioned earlier.
And when you look inside 388 BV, do you see the adhesive stubs that you use in this case?
The adhesive stubs are not here unless they've been put inside. Oh, they're inside actually. So the adhesive stubs are a separate item that I created once I was finished sampling the headliner.
And when you say you sampled the headliner, what do you mean?
I will take the adhesive samplers and we call it dab randomly across the surface of that headliner. I used 2 stubs in total when it came to actually sampling the surface of the headliner. Keep in mind this is a sampling process. Not every square millimeter of that entire headliner can be covered by these stubs. So like I mentioned, I used 2 of these stubs and then a third stub, which was just exposed to the collection environment in the processing room that I did the sampling in, just to show that there's no extraneous GSR particles in the processing room that will also be carried along through the examination process along with the stubs that I used to sample the actual headliner.
And is there any reason why you didn't sample or take every piece of the headliner and test every piece of it? It's a large surface area, and it is not efficient to be able to, I guess, get a representative sample of the entire surface area. But, per policy for us, it is up to the examiner's discretion. Whenever the tack or the adhesive, the stickiness is lost on those samplers, you can either stop there with your sampling or use another adhesive sampler to continue sampling. And for me, I used 2 stubs for this particular headliner. And what was the results of your testing?
The samples from the headliner, from the Audi A5, failed to reveal any particles that are characteristic of GSR.
Now, since you only tested a sample of the headliner, is it possible that there could have been GSR on the portion that you did not sample or that you did not stub?
It is possible that there is a small amount of GSR somewhere on that headliner that I happened to miss with the sampling process.
Now, I want to ask you a few hypotheticals. If a person is driving a car and they pull up to a red light, and at that red light, the same driver, I'm going to ask first, sticks their hand outside of the window, and they fire a .40 caliber handgun, would you expect gunshot residue to enter into the car that the driver was in?
And is the driver that stuck the...
Yes, the driver is the person who stuck their hands outside of the window and fired the firearm.
It's possible that a small amount of GSR could still be deposited inside the vehicle through that open window or door, perhaps, but not particularly a large amount of GSR. Most of that cloud or plume of GSR particles would be outside of the vehicle, but some of that still could be deposited inside as well.
Now, hypothetically, if a person,
Ms. Hilton, if you're gonna get that far away from the mic, will you use the lapel mic or pick one up and carry it with you, please?
sure, I'll stay by the mic, Your Honor. Hypothetically, is this good? Can you hear me? Okay. Hypothetically, if a person is driving a vehicle and they have passengers in that vehicle, and for some reason they're in the same car, the passenger shoots a gun inside of the car, inside of the same car, would you expect to find GSR inside of that vehicle?
Yes, if the gun is discharged within the cabin of that vehicle, I would expect to find GSR inside of that vehicle.
Would you expect to find more GSR in that vehicle where the gun was shot in the cabin, more than the gun that was shot outside of the window of the driver's side?
Yes, it is reasonable to expect that more GSR particles will be found in the vehicle where the firearm was discharged inside of the vehicle versus the vehicle where the firearm was discharged outside of the window of the vehicle.
The deputy.
And in this case, outside of testing the headliner, do you know anything about where that headliner came from? Outside of knowing that it came from an Audi A5, do you know anything else about that vehicle?
No, I do not.
Course indulgence for a moment.
Yeah, Mickey, it sounds like they're just trying to prove a possibility, no matter how slight and slim. And that's not how this is supposed to work.
My last question for now. Do the conditions in which a vehicle is stored affect whether or not you'll be able to find GSR? So for example, if the gun is fired outside of a vehicle and the windows remain down, or the sunroof is open, or the sunroof's open and closed multiple times, does that at all affect whether or not you will find GSR inside of the car?
If the GSR particles are already deposited inside of the vehicle, I suppose it's possible that you would lose a small amount if the windows are down or the sunroof is open.
Why did she
just based
ask?
on wind or maybe if it rained or something like that. But I wouldn't expect for there to be a huge difference based off of that alone.
Thank you so much. No further
Why
questions.
did you even ask?
Mr. Covin, good.
Hold on, we're going to rewind and get to Schardt's full introduction. She conferred with her team. Any more questions? And the team is like, yeah, ask if the sunroof is open, if that could explain why there was no gunshot residue. And her witness is like, I suppose a little could be lost. Scratch my head, obviously, making my facial expression like, I don't want to say it's outside the realm of possibility entirely. But again, as we're talking about, as Mickey's talking about here, the state has to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And they're fighting for a slim possibility chance to keep this alive. That's not the way this works. But Hilton conferred with her team just to go and ask that question, just to have egg on her face. Oh my gosh, let's get to cross, you guys. Let's get to cross.
Thank you so much. No further questions. All right.
Mr. Covin, good. Morning.
Good morning.
My name is Max Schardt. I represent Shannon Stillwell. I appreciate you being here today. I'm going to ask you, let's play the hypotheticals first, and then I'm going to get into the work you actually did in this case, okay?
Okay.
All right.
We're
So,
going to watch this on one.
you were just asked about some hypotheticals. Let's just be clear. In your expert opinion, if a gun was shot inside the cabin of a car and the sunroof was opened subsequently to the gunfire and the windows were opened and someone was driving around, in your expert opinion, the gunshot residue inside that car would remain, correct?
And this is after the gun was already discharged and the GSR was deposited?
Yes.
Yes, I would expect for there to be surfaces inside of that vehicle where the GSR particles remained, yes.
Okay, you were asked about a hypothetical where someone sticks their hand out the window. The driver sticks their hand out the window and shoots. Okay, first of all, there's a possibility that there would still be gunshot residue inside the cabin in that circumstance, correct?
That is correct.
Because it's a large plume of microscopic particles. How many particles are there typically, gunshot residue particles, discharged from a gun when it is fired?
We don't have a very accurate count on that for sure, because that's very difficult to count. But I would expect on the order of hundreds, at the very least, to be created when a firearm is discharged. Now, where those particles are deposited, that's a different story.
Could it be thousands?
It could be thousands, I can't say for sure. It's all dependent on how many shots we're talking about and how large the caliber of the firearm was.
And let me ask you this. So 3 to 4 shots fired outside the car, inside the car, either way, that would increase the amount of particles that are expelled from the firearm 3 to 4 times, correct?
Yes, it would, yes.
That would make it more likely, even if a gun is shot outside a window, that there would be gunshot residue within the cabin that could be detected by you later on, correct?
Yes, that is reasonable to expect that there will be more available to deposit on some surface somewhere, yes.
Okay, and while we're playing the hypothetical, if someone stuck their arm out the window, the driver's side window of a car and fired a gun, and it was on video, you would expect to see muzzle flashes, wouldn't you?
On video?
Yes.
That's reasonable to expect. Yes, with a gunfire, with a discharging firearm, yes.
He is mocking the state. This is beautiful.
You familiar with tint application?
A little bit,
You're not
yes.
supposed to down the window within 24 to 48 hours after the tint is applied, correct?
That is what I've been told before, yes.
Leads to bubbling, leads to damage to the tint,
That's correct.
okay? If a car is collected that had recently had tint applied and there was no, within hours of this alleged shooting, and then there was no damage to that tint when it was later, when the car was later processed, would that be evidence that the window was never opened to shoot out at someone?
That is outside of my expertise. I'm not a window tint expert. I know I've been told that as well before with my own vehicle, but I cannot say for sure that that is the case here.
Well, while we were doing hypotheticals, I just wanted to ask that as well. Okay, but
Did you see
ultimately,
Doug?
Getting back
Look
to
at Doug.
the work you actually did, not hypotheticals. You've done with GBI, how long have you been working with GBI?
Over 9.5 years now.
Okay, excellent. You've done thousands of tests for gunshot residue, correct?
Just over 1,000, yes.
Just over 1,000. You've tested headliners before, correct?
Yes, I have.
This isn't the first time.
No, it's not.
Okay, headliners are a relatively common part of a car to be collected to test for gunshot residue, correct?
To either be collected or someone has sampled a headliner and submitted it to us, yes.
And the reason is because the headliner, where it's situated in the car, would be a place where the gunshot residue, if the gun is fired in the car or even potentially outside the car, would be a place where gunshot residue would be deposited, correct?
That is correct. A good area for them to be retained if they were indeed deposited.
And you said retained. Retained, also, the headliners, they're a cloth fabric, correct?
That's correct.
Textiles.
Typically,
Textiles, correct?
correct.
Different than a hand where you sweat and different things of that nature. These textiles tend to maintain and absorb absorb's a bad word, maintain the gunshot residue particles better than skin, for instance.
That's correct. Any item that's of cloth material or textile has the ability to hold on to or retain GSR particles better than a harder surface or better than a person's hands, simply due to the fact that we use our hands a lot. The more you're touching surfaces, you're going to lose those particles, or just washing your hands will cause you to lose all of those particles.
Okay. And in your work on this case, you took the headliner and you dabbed it with those sticky tabs, correct?
That is correct.
Did everything by the procedures as you were taught, correct?
That is correct.
You did everything by the procedures as is standing operating procedure with GBI, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And in fact, you used that one tab, and then in fact, you broke out a second tab and continued to dab the headliner, correct?
That is correct.
How many dabs do you do with each tab?
Again, per our policy and our standards, we are to, and then it's at the discretion of the examiner, but we will continue to dab until the tackiness or the stickiness of that adhesive surface is lost. And at that point, then you can move on to a second stub or third or however many there were, or be finished with your sampling process. So in this particular case, I can't really tell you for sure how many dabs that was. Maybe a couple dozen or more than that, but I can't tell you for sure. We don't notate how many dabs there were.
All right. And you said that just dabbing, you probably didn't cover the entire surface of the headliner, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, but the reality is you don't need to effectively test for gunshot residue, correct?
That is correct. Again, unfortunately, just due to the nature of the sampling process, we can't get to every square millimeter of that entire surface. So it's possible that some things could have been missed, but this is a sampling process that is recognized throughout the forensic community and is standard for us when it comes to sampling any items for GSR.
Well, and the reality is, when we're talking about GSR, a gun doesn't disperse GSR to one little spot, all the GSR to one little spot on a headliner. It sends a plume, correct?
That is correct. A plume or a cloud,
And
yes.
so when you're saying we didn't cover every little spot, in your training experience using, in fact, not only one tab, but two tabs and dozens of dabs, in your 9.5 years experience, you dabbed enough to get an accurate representation of whether that headliner was exposed to a plume of gunshot residue, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
You felt great about the work you did. You followed all the procedures.
Yes, I did feel good about the sampling process that I did.
Okay. Let me ask you, you've said you've been called to testify 82 times.
When it comes to GSR, yes.
Is it fair to
82
say
times.
that the majority of those times you came to testify in court, the GSR was positive?
You said the majority of the time?
When the state called you.
Potentially. Potentially.
Okay. Has the state called you personally as an expert in gunshot residue at times when the result was positive?
Yes, they have.
Okay. And when the result was positive, you came and shared with the jury about what the results were.
That is correct.
And it was the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, just be clear, Fulton County District Attorney's Office has called you to testify about positive results before, correct?
Objection on relevance?
Overruled. You can answer.
I cannot say for sure, remembering my results from testifying in Fulton County, but it is reasonable to expect that there were some that were positive, and I was asked to testify to my results for them here, yes.
Okay. So when the results were positive, the work was done well according to the prosecutors.
I can't really speak to,
Sustained.
Okay. All right, now, I want to ask you, going back to another hypothetical that I left out. The hypothetical of washing. Hypothetically, you can wash your hands, correct?
that is correct,
And that can remove gunshot residue.
correct.
And you've talked about clothing and textiles and the potential to wash textiles or clothing, correct?
That's correct,
And you also said that there's studies that show even textiles or clothing, even if they go through the wash, still have gunshot residue, correct?
that is correct.
All right, but here's the thing. I want to talk about this case. Do you have any evidence? Is there any evidence that you noted in your report, any evidence that this headliner had been washed?
There's no evidence that was noted or given to me that would indicate that it had been washed, but I would never really know for sure, based off of what I am given to examine for the GSR analysis.
Well, I want to talk about the premise of the hypothetical. You do not have any evidence that this headliner was washed.
No, I do not.
Okay. All right, and ultimately, the results, well, we talked about hundreds or thousands, or you said maybe thousands of particles. What is the threshold? I know that you said it's negative. The headliner was on each and every one of those tabs. When you looked under the scanning electron microscope with the beams, the electron beams, the result was negative. But what I want to know, what is the threshold for a positive?
We don't really use the word positive. It's just, is the GSR there or not? And all you need is just one particle to say that, yes, there are particles characteristic of GSR present on this
Look
surface.
at the state.
So all you need is one particle under that scanning electron microscope with the electron beams to be a positive result.
That is correct.
And in this case, the result of that headliner was negative, meaning you did not even see one particle of gunshot residue on that headliner.
That is correct.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Redirect.
Reluctant to get up.
Mr. Schardt just asked you if there was evidence that the car was washed. Do you know, sitting here, if there's evidence that it was not washed or cleaned?
No, I do not.
Mr. Schardt asked you about muzzle flashing on a video. Do you remember him asking about that?
Yes.
If the video is grainy, would you expect to see muzzle flash?
I really can't
What do you
tell
know?
you for sure without actually seeing the video myself. I suppose the graininess of a video could impact that, but I can't say for sure.
And just because you don't see muzzle flash, does that mean a shooting did not occur?
I'm not really too sure on that one either.
You talked about a plume, the smoke or the cloud that comes out. The direction of the cloud, is that in the direction of the projectile of the bullet? Is that the direction of the plume that we are talking of?
So the plume or cloud is formed around the discharging firearm. Yes, the plume could have a more dense population of GSR particles in certain areas, depending on the environmental factors or what type of firearm it was. But it is a cloud or a plume of GSR particles that is created. And then you will also have some GSR particles traveling in the direction of the bullet, with the bullet itself.
Can the length of time between the depositing of the GSR and the testing affect whether or not you will find GSR?
Yes, it can, just due to any factors or any events that could have occurred in the interim. So those GSR particles are deposited. Were they washed or wiped away or lost for whatever environmental reasons? That could affect the amount of GSR particles that are picked up when it's finally sampled for GSR. Of course, I can't say for sure what happened, but those are things that can affect any GSR examination, yes.
And do you have in your notes when you tested the headliner?
I sampled the headliner on June 1st, 2022.
They had the car right away though, so
All right.
okay.
And again, cleaning, vacuuming inside of a car, inside of a vehicle, that can affect whether or not we find GSR. Is that fair?
Yes,
Or- Sorry.
I'm sorry. Yes, that will affect the amount of GSR particles that are there.
Thank you. No further questions.
So now we're dealing with a hypothetical about vacuuming. Do you have any evidence that this headliner was vacuumed?
No, I do not.
Okay. And when, I understand that you collected the samples on June 1st, 2022.
That's correct.
When did you receive the headliner from APD?
APD submitted the headliner on March 23rd, 2022.
Okay, between March 23rd, may I approach? And this is the headliner?
Yes.
Okay, between March 23rd and June 1st, did the headliner, was it continuously, uninterruptedly kept in this evidence bag?
Based on the notes that I have and the records that I have, yes, it was.
And this evidence bag was sealed?
Yes, it was.
So no one from GBI took this headliner between March 23rd and June 1st and slipped it in the laundry?
No, they did not.
No one took the headliner and went out on Panthersville Road and ran in the yard with the headliner, just waving it around?
That's correct. No, they did
Okay,
not.
it was maintained in this sealed evidence bag,
Yes, it was.
just like all other evidence that is brought in to GBI for testing, correct?
That is correct.
All right, thank you. No further questions.
All right, thank you for your time. You are excused. Helen Schultz, next witness.
Thank you.
Relatively short, Your Honor.